Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
We're back for the second episode of Season 2 with Dr. Georgia Edes, who is a psychiatrist, a researcher, and an advocate of nutrition and diet as an alternative approach to standard medications. She's also a speaker and writer, and although has spent much time working and taking courses at Harvard, she has not fallen into their plant-based diet dogma. She, in fact, researches plants and some of their negative effects in a human diet. It seems really counterintuitive to most, but there's hard science out there about this. People are curing diseases and their depression and anxiety by cutting out certain plant foods. She's also an expert on Alzheimer's and how what we eat affects the onset of this scary disease, which we get into a little. We also do some debunking of studies, including the new low-carb and longevity study, as well as that old WHO study trying to claim red meat causes cancer. Please listen carefully to this important and eye-opening episode. I really enjoyed my discussion with her, and she provides a lot of great information. We're in the last 24 hours of the Food Lies Kickstarter campaign, so please pre-order the film there now to make sure you get it. Backers will receive the film a couple months early, and there's a bunch of other perks you can get as well. You'll get your name in the credits as a backer of the film, as well as options like the It's What Else You Eat, Not the Meat t-shirt, and the special features bonus footage. Thanks so much for supporting us in this project. It really is a lot of work, and we're not accepting outside funding, only from people like you. Okay, now enjoy the show. Hello, Dr. Georgia Edes. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today.
Thank you, Brian, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Great. Yeah, I found you organically in all my research, and then I saw you popping up at the conferences and on podcasts and on YouTube. So it's really great to be talking to you about all this stuff today.
I am 100% organic, so.
That is good to hear. So you are a psychiatrist. So why don't you just describe your background experience for people a bit and your philosophies on medical treatment and health, and just go for it.
Absolutely. So I've been a psychiatrist for almost 20 years. And a psychiatrist, just for people who don't know, to distinguish from a psychologist, psychiatrists go to medical school and can prescribe medications. And when I first started my career, I practiced conventional, kind of regular psychiatry. I prescribed medications. I also offered psychotherapy, no-talk therapy for patients in lots of different settings. I worked in hospitals and private practices and community clinics, and I loved my work, but I didn't have any interest in nutrition as it pertained to psychiatry back then when I first started practicing. But there were many, many patients that I was struggling to help, not just those with mental health problems that didn't respond to medications, but also people with conditions that kind of cross the line between psychiatry and sort of mental health and physical health, things like chronic pain and chronic fatigue, which a lot of my patients, especially my middle-aged and older patients, were struggling with. So in any case, about 10 years ago, through my own health challenges that arose, I started experimenting with my diet to try to help myself with some symptoms that I'd come down with, which were looking a lot like some of my patients had. So things like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue and IBS and migraines, despite eating what I was told to eat, sort of low fat, low cholesterol, high fiber. And even I was I stayed away from most junk food back then, and I exercised every day. I was doing what I think most people think would be good for them. And despite all of that, I came down with all of these mysterious syndromes. And at the time, I was working at Harvard University, and I had access to lots of smart and caring Harvard specialists who ran all kinds of tests and couldn't figure out what was wrong. And they basically said that nothing was wrong. But of course, something must have been wrong. So I started experimenting with my diet. And over about the course of 6 months of trial and error, this was, again, about 10 years ago, I arrived at this diet, which was almost the opposite of what I had been told was healthy for me, which is mostly meat. I was eating almost entirely meat. I'd removed almost all the plant foods of my diet in order to feel better. And all of the things that I had come across symptom-wise completely resolved by taking most of the plant foods out of my diet. And I just was stunned by that. I was really surprised, honestly surprised. And the thing that really surprised me was that my mental health, which had never been that bad to begin with, so it was relatively good, was even better than it had been. And it wasn't even something I was trying to work on. So as a psychiatrist, I thought, well, how does that work? How is it that this high meat, low plant diet, how is this good for my brain? As a psychiatrist, I would like to understand that. And also, I was scared to death that the new diet I'd stumbled upon was going to kill me because I thought it was heart disease, et cetera. So long story short, I started studying nutrition for the first time and really in depth and reading everything I could get my hands on, and started a website to explore these ideas and started speaking about nutrition and incorporating nutrition principles into my psychiatric practice. And I've been doing that now for quite a few years. So now I practice a combination of conventional psychiatry and nutritional psychiatry. And in fact, just a couple of months ago, I decided to take some time away from conventional psychiatry and focus 100% of my time on nutritional psychiatry.
That's so great. I mean, so many people would have no idea that nutrition affected your brain. And I feel like all psychiatrists should look into this and use this approach.
I agree. And I was just as surprised as most people, I think, would be hearing this. When I was, for 4 years of medical school, we had maybe 2 or 3 hours of nutrition education. And in 4 years of psychiatry residency, we didn't speak about nutrition once in 4 years.
That's crazy. So
Yeah.
that doesn't make any sense. I don't know why people in the medical field don't realize that what contacts your body every day, what you have the most contact with is food. And that should be the first thing you look at what manifests in your body.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's hard for me to remember what it used to feel like to not think that. I just really never crossed my mind. As a woman who, with long history of weight problems going back to childhood, I used to think of food as simply a way to control my weight. What I ate was just about how to keep my weight from going up, which it tended to do very easily. But of course, if you think about it for a hot second, the most powerful way to change brain chemistry is through food, because that's where brain chemicals come from in the first place.
Absolutely. Why don't you talk more about that for a second, about hormones and cholesterol and fat?
Oh, yeah. I love all of those questions. So really, nutrition is quite simple. It has been distorted and made very confusing by a certain branch of nutrition science, which kind of dominates the nutrition headlines. It's called nutritional epidemiology. These are questionnaire-based studies which generate guesses about what we should eat based on people's memories, which are extremely poor. How much broccoli did you eat over the past year on average? Those kinds of questions. So most of the headlines we see are constantly changing and confusing. And most people think nutrition is really complicated. But it's actually, if you set aside all of those questionnaire-based studies, which are most of the nutrition studies in the world, you set those aside and you just look at all the other branches of science. We know a lot about what the brain is made of, how food operates in the body, how we process plant and animal foods. It's incredibly simple. Nutrition is incredibly simple. So we need animal protein. We need fat. We do not seem to need plants, as far as I can tell, although you're welcome to include them if they don't bother you. But everything we need is in animal foods, and everything else seems to be optional. So, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're often led to believe. So, for example, the brain, everything the brain needs is in animal foods. The brain is about 2/3 fat, and it contains 20% of the body's cholesterol, even though it's only 2% of the body's weight. So it's very rich in cholesterol. And that cholesterol is made in the brain, by the brain itself. It does not come from the food we eat. Cholesterol can't cross from your bloodstream into the brain. So the brain makes its own cholesterol on purpose. It needs it that badly. So that's something a lot of people don't know. And then all of the vitamins and minerals, the brain is actually an energy hog. It's an electrical organ, and it has to be working at, sort of tip-top speed 24/7. And in order for it to function properly and extract energy from food, glucose or ketones, depending on what you're eating, in order for it to extract energy from food, it needs lots of vitamins and minerals to run the chemical reactions to get the energy out of food. And so the brain actually needs more vitamins and minerals than most other organs do. And those vitamins and minerals are easiest to obtain from animal foods. Plant foods are not only missing certain key brain nutrients, they also sometimes contain a form that is harder for us to use, and they often contain things called anti-nutrients, which interfere with our ability to absorb nutrients, particularly minerals, for example, from food. So the easiest way to feed your brain everything it needs is to include animal foods with their natural fats in your diet.
Yes. And we should dive into so many things you just said, especially even this new study that I'd love to talk about. I saw some of your tweets that were going viral actually about breaking down this new study that I'm sure everyone listening's heard about. Every news outlet picked it up. It's such a hot thing to report so that it can get clicks and to reinforce people's carb addiction. It's so funny that all I hear is people texting me about this, trying to say that my whole movie's going to be wrong. And it's just so stupid. It's so far from the truth. And we'll dive into that and other stuff. But basically, if we stick to psychiatry and stick to your patients for a second, so brain health is so important, and people never really think about the underlying causes, right? People just want to prescribe medications and get you out of the office. Maybe we can talk about depression, actually, because,
Sure.
because I've anecdotally heard a lot about people who go on a mostly animal-based diet and their symptoms of anxiety and depression go away.
Mm-hmm. That's right. So I personally, about 3 months ago, switched from a very low plant ketogenic diet, which is a very low carbohydrate diet with very few plants in it that I've been eating for many years. I switched from that about 3 months ago to an all meat diet for a variety of reasons I won't bore your listeners with right now, but I did that. And so I have personal experience with that type of diet. And I do feel in a variety of ways even better than I did on the ketogenic diet, with that had some plants in it. So I believe people when they tell me this, and there aren't any studies, there aren't any clinical scientific studies, what they call a randomized controlled trial, which is supposed to be the sort of the gold standard of research studies, sort of demonstrating that all meat diets can improve mental health. We only have lots of anecdotes at this point, personal stories. So the reason why I think they may be helpful, these all meat diets, is because, first of all, they exclude all of the carbohydrates. And some people are quite sensitive, not just to the refined carbohydrates like sugar and flour and fruit juice and cereals, which none of us should be eating on any regular basis, because those refined carbohydrates that give you big spikes in blood sugar and insulin, those types of carbohydrates are mood destabilizers. They destabilize almost all of the hormone levels in your body throughout the day. So including your sex hormones and including your stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. So if you avoid the refined carbohydrates and you have a healthy metabolism, you might be able to do just fine with other types of carbohydrates from whole foods, for example, fruits and vegetables. But because some people have a very damaged metabolism, and because some people may have a leaky gut and may have a leaky brain barrier as well, natural chemicals that are in plants, which they use to defend themselves, can perhaps be getting into the bloodstream, and perhaps, we don't know this for sure, maybe getting into the brain as well. This is a hypothesis. It's not been tested, but this is a guess about, why would people feel better removing all the plants from their diet if they have a mental health issue and all else has failed? Mm-hmm. So that's one possibility. But the other is that, as we were talking about before, plant foods contain a lot of anti-nutrients that interfere with good nutrition. And so the fewer plants we eat, the easier it is for us to nourish our brains, and the easier it is for our brains to function properly. This is, at least according to my research, reading of the studies, is very clear. There's no question that plants interfere with nutrient absorption, and there's no question that plants are lacking certain key brain nutrients like DHA, which is an essential omega-3 fatty acid, and vitamin B12. So depending on which diet the person started with before they changed to an all-meat diet, there can be lots of improvements. If you change from an already very, very clean, low-carb, healthy whole foods, sort of what I call a pre-agricultural diet that doesn't have any grains or legumes or dairy in it, which are just really complicated foods, which make everything more difficult, which are difficult for us to process. If you're already eating what I would consider to be a very, very clean diet that included some plants, and then you switched to an all meat diet, there are fewer differences there. But if you were eating anything more than that, if you were including grains or beans or dairy or refined carbohydrates or industrial chemicals and flavorings and so forth in your diet, there are lots of ways that an all meat diet is better for you than that.
Yeah, so it does make a lot of sense. And we see the mechanisms that are going on. So it's just hard to do these trials that all this nutrition science is really hard to do. But why don't you talk about how vegetables protect themselves, right? That's why they have these anti-nutrients.
Yes. So animals, all creatures want to defend themselves, and all creatures want to reproduce and survive and reproduce. And in order to do that, they have to protect themselves from being eaten. So no creature wants to be eaten. So animals protect themselves with fangs and claws and growling and chasing and things like that. And vegetables and other plant foods, even though they may look innocent and approachable, they are actually defending themselves as well. They can't move, they can't growl, chase you, they can't, they don't have claws, some have thorns, but they defend themselves with very sophisticated chemical weapons. And these chemical weapons have been evolving in the plant kingdom for hundreds of millions of years. These plants have been around on the planet a lot longer than we have, and they know what they're doing. So really, they're there. Those chemicals are there to protect the plant from little insects and worms and bacteria and fungi from coming up and trying to feast on them. So, but these chemicals are designed to literally kill animal cells, and we are animals. So now we've evolved alongside these plants for a long time, and many of these plant foods we have been eating for a very, very long time. So we do have, in most cases, mechanisms in the body to deal with these chemicals. For example, many of these chemicals we don't absorb well. And some of these chemicals, the ones that we do absorb, we often will rapidly detoxify them and eliminate them as fast as we possibly can. Mm-hmm. However, if you're eating too many plant foods, or if you're particularly sensitive, or if you have a damaged gut lining or a damaged immune system, you may be more susceptible to the natural toxins in plant foods. And I think more and more of us are discovering that. And I can't be sure why this is. I'm not saying it's entirely due to poor diet, although I think that could be a major factor. Eating the wrong things for too long could be damaging our systems, but also the environmental toxins and antibiotics and pesticides and things that are in our food supply that weren't, even 100 years ago, could also be playing a role. So I think more people are sensitive to plant foods than may realize it.
Yeah. The problem is you sound like a complete quack if you start saying that vegetables are bad for you. I can't even begin to start talking about people. They'll walk away. They're like, so you're telling me that vegetables and fruits are bad? I can't listen to you anymore.
Well, I appreciate that. And I completely understand why people feel that way. And they're right to be skeptical, because what I'm saying flies in the face of almost everything else they've ever heard. Mm-hmm. But I would ask people just to do a little imagination experiment. So as a psychiatrist, I like to put myself in other people's shoes, right? So if I'm a plant, what parts of my body do I want you to eat? I want you to eat, if you're a good vehicle for my seeds, I want you to eat my fruit, right? Mm-hmm. So fruits need animals to transport their seeds to, plop them down in another place and perhaps in a good spot to grow, right? So plants make fruits very appealing, juicy, sweet, and relatively non-toxic. Mm-hmm. They certainly don't want to kill you if they need you. Mm-hmm. So fruits are delicious. They don't need to be cooked. They don't need to be boiled. They don't need to be fermented. They don't need to be soaked. Mm-hmm. You don't need to do anything to them to make them easy to digest and delicious. So I think that fruits are the safest plant foods. There are definitely poisonous fruits out there in the world, but we know which ones those are. Mm-hmm. But quote unquote edible fruits are designed to be eaten. The problem is when we start to recommend that people form the basis of their diet on seed foods. The seeds are the most heavily defended parts of the plant. If I'm a plant, the last thing in the world I want you to do is grind up my seeds and eat them, because those are the future generations of the plant. Mm-hmm. So the seeds are very heavily defended. They're loaded with lectins and phytic acid and all kinds of other things that make it very difficult for us to digest them and to use their nutrients. And we've only been eating grains and beans as staple foods for a relatively small amount of time from an evolutionary standpoint. So depending on where your ancestors live, maybe between 8 and 10,000 years. And that may sound like a long time, but from an evolutionary standpoint, it's really a short period of time. So the flowers, grains and beans and flowers, those parts of the plant are very difficult for us to handle. They're very different from fruits. And then vegetables, which are just the rest of the plant, the stalk or the leaves, those are also defended, but they're also not particularly delicious. They can be bitter. They can be unappealing unless you cook them or put butter or salt or cheese on them or some kind of sauce, which many people do. And it may help to explain why children don't love vegetables and have to be convinced to eat them. You don't have to convince a child to eat a fruit, but getting to eat broccoli is another story.
Mm-hmm. Or meat either. You don't have to
or meat.
Yeah.
Well, you're making a good point, which is one thing I notice for myself and that a lot of my patients and colleagues and other associates have noticed is that if you eat a diet that's high in refined carbohydrates like sugar and flour, you kind of lose interest in all other food. And I know this is true for myself. Back when I used to eat that way, I could have meat in the refrigerator and it would go bad because I wanted the other foods. And this is true I know so many parents with kids and I've worked over the past 13 years primarily with college students, so many people who, they eat a lot of refined carbohydrates. They just don't want to eat anything else. And it's partly because they're addictive. And it's partly because I think your taste buds become adapted to that very, very sweet taste. Mm-hmm. And then nothing else really is appealing. It's sort of like if you're an alcoholic, you might look at a glass of water and think, is that all you've got to drink? Mm-hmm. Don't you have anything else? So that's how I see it anyway.
Well, it's sort of the opposite too. When people go more on the carnivore side, they don't care about sugar anymore. It seems like they don't have that sweet tooth and all they want is the savory taste.
Well, thank goodness for that, because that has been my saving grace changing to this diet. I have very, very few cravings on a low carbohydrate, very, very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet that included some plants, but I still would have them sometimes. It was hard to stick to every single day all year long. This is the longest, I think it's been about, I don't know, what did I say, about 3 months or so? It's the longest I've ever gone being 100% faithful to any diet. And it's very, very easy. And I thought it would be hard. I thought it'd be more difficult because it's so restrictive. But I don't want your listeners, I'm not here to tell your listeners they need to stop eating plants. Mm-hmm. What I want people to know about brain health is that there's hope. If you have a brain health problem of any type, there's a lot to be gained by experimenting with your diet. And the first place to start is with all the junk foods. And there are some foods that we don't think of as junk foods that are. Mm-hmm. So the grains and the legumes and the flours and the sugars, fruit juice, anything that gives you a blood sugar spike is really dangerous for your mental health. And most people eat those kinds of things 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day. So if you're going to take aim at something in your diet, you don't necessarily need to go to an all-meat diet. That's a very extreme diet to jump to. At least take out the refined carbohydrates and the vegetable oils. The so-called vegetable oils promote inflammation in the body. They're unnaturally high in omega-6, which fights against omega-3 and causes inflammation in the body and brain. So these are things like soybean oil and sunflower oil and corn oil and all of the vegetable oils.
Yeah. And then then you can go from there and experiment. And, we've talked about the elimination diet before on this podcast, but it's not saying people should not eat plants ever again or everyone has to do this. It's experiment with yourself, eliminate things, and then you can see what actually is going on with your body when you're eating them.
Exactly. It's all about that, because if you wait for the study to come out that is going to address your specific problem, you're going to be waiting a really long time. And you don't have to wait. You can do these experiments quite safely with your own diet. You were saying how people seem to want to take medication and psychiatrists seem to want to prescribe medication. And I think that's often true, but especially working with college students, I will often have students come into the office saying, I want an all-natural approach for my depression. And I'll say, great, let's talk about sugar. Let's talk about see if we can at least get the sugar down in your diet. And that would be the first thing I would recommend doing if you want an all-natural approach. And this is a really hard sell because they look at me like I have 3 heads. What do you mean? I can't have chocolate. I can't eat my, smoothies, drink my smoothies. And I understand how hard it is. There just is no other way around it. You've got to get the junk out. You can't simply add a superfood to your diet and expect everything to miraculously improve. The superfoods don't work. You've got to take the junk out.
Yeah, well, that's cool that people these days seem like they're into whole natural approaches. So how do you approach people who are resistant? How do you get people to make a change in their diet? Because it sounds very counterintuitive. I wouldn't have believed this, 6 months ago either. So how do you get people to change, on a day-to-day basis with these real patients you're dealing with?
Well, if I knew how to do it 100% of the time, I would probably win some sort of a global prize.
Yeah.
But it's really difficult. Changing behavior is very difficult. And convincing someone to change a habit is very difficult too. So what I'll usually do is I will ask the student if they'll let me order some blood tests and just see where things stand for them in terms of nutrients and metabolism, just see where they're at. And I'll talk with them. I'll ask them if they eat a special diet of any kind. We'll talk a little bit about food in that first interview. And that sort of, when I ask really basic questions about food, that's a way for me to tell how open that person is to discussing diet in general, because diet is a bit of a third rail sometimes. It's almost like religion or politics. People have really strong feelings about food. And so I am careful not to antagonize people who are not interested in talking about diet. If you don't want to talk about diet, that's okay. I do prescribe medications. We can go there. We can talk about other lifestyle changes, but that's a bit of a test there. And then the other thing, then I get the lab tests back and I go over them with them. And what we see most commonly, even in these young college students who you would expect to be in the prime of their health, what you see often is clear signs of insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is sometimes called prediabetes. It's a metabolic disorder which is easily addressed with dietary changes. It's sort of an indication of how good your carbohydrate metabolism is, for lack of a better description. So how broken it is. So I can show students where they're at on the insulin resistance spectrum and show them and explain to them that if they were to make a few changes, they might be able to see these numbers come down. Triglycerides, for example, fasting insulin level, they might be able to see the changes in these numbers and even maybe lose a little weight if they're interested in that within even just a few weeks. So that's very motivating. I use those numbers as motivators, and the concrete information can be really helpful. And the other thing I see quite commonly is iron deficiency. And iron deficiency is really common in women. 10 to 20% of women are iron deficient. And iron deficiency is not just a blood problem. Iron deficiency is a brain problem. We cannot make certain neurotransmitters like dopamine without iron. So I work with them to help them understand which foods are the best sources of iron, which of course are the animal foods, and which sources of food are interfering with iron metabolism and absorption. And these include surprising foods like grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, and spinach. So even though people think of spinach, Popeye eats spinach for iron, yes, spinach is loaded with iron, but you cannot absorb any of that iron because spinach contains oxalates, which interfere with iron absorption. So I have had students tell me, oh my gosh, does that mean that the spinach smoothie I've been making every morning for my iron deficiency isn't helping? I said, exactly right. So just having these really interesting conversations, like sort of sparking curiosity and imagination about food and getting people kind of into a curious experimental mode and having them get invested in their own health. Now, this is not something that works with everyone. I don't pretend that I can change everyone's diet. Actually, the change has to come from the other person in the room, but at least getting people thinking and explaining to them how crucial insulin resistance is. We think of insulin resistance as a problem with carbohydrate metabolism that might cause diabetes down the road, or maybe it'll cause weight gain, make it hard to lose weight. Most people don't realize that insulin resistance is a brain problem. Insulin resistance of the brain makes it difficult for insulin to cross into the brain. Glucose, sugar, passes into the brain, waltzes in, no questions asked, no matter how high your blood sugar is or how far along you are on the insulin resistance spectrum. Glucose, sugar, rushes into the brain. Your brain will never be without enough sugar. The problem is insulin has a hard time crossing in, and you can't use that sugar for energy or to build any cell parts in the brain if you don't have enough insulin. So what happens in all of the major mental health problems, we're finding this to be the case, particularly with Alzheimer's disease, where there's a lot of excellent science available. If you have insulin resistance of the brain, then your brain cells will be swimming in a sea of glucose, but your brain cells will literally be starving to death if you can't get enough insulin across. And that is exactly what Alzheimer's is, death and shrinkage of the brain cells. And, this begins decades before Alzheimer's ever begins. And I sometimes wonder, you can see insulin resistance of the brain on special imaging scans called PET scans. So they've found signs of insulin resistance in the brain in women as young as 24 years old. So this is really chilling to me as a psychiatrist who specializes in college mental health. I mean, does this help to explain why so many of my students say to me, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, that, oh, Dr. Ede, my memory is not as good as it was in high school. Well, why is that? Maybe it's drinking or, but maybe it's your diet. And I can't be sure about that. We don't have the science to back that up. It's just a question, but all of the major mental illnesses are now associated with insulin resistance. And there are even some studies showing that depression and psychotic disorders respond well to medications that improve insulin resistance. And these are not antidepressant medications. So that's interesting too.
Oh my, there's so many things I want to talk about. I mean, we did a podcast with Amy Berger, and she talked about, a lot of people talk about Alzheimer's as being type 3 diabetes, right? That's, and what's really scary is that people don't know the damage they're doing. And it, like you said, maybe 30 years before you have a cognitive decline or full-blown Alzheimer's, you could be doing damage and you wouldn't know it just from this insulin resistance of the brain.
That's exactly right. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of Amy Berger's work and of her book, The Alzheimer's Antidote. Highly recommend. I've read it cover to cover. It's wonderful. She really knows her science. She may have mentioned to you, I don't know, that by the time you notice any memory problems, early sort of pre-Alzheimer's, your hippocampus, which is the little memory organ inside your brain that records memories, it's already shrunk by up to 25%. I'm sorry, by 10%. Your glucose utilization in the brain has already gone down by as much as 25%. So what that means is that your brain is sluggish in processing glucose, and you may have lost up to 25% of your brain power by the time you notice any real memory problems.
Wow. To make a generalization, it sounds like patients you see are having the most problems are eating mostly plant-based, supposedly healthy diets. And they may be women because you're saying more of them are iron deficient. Is it right to say that it seems like more women are scared to eat red meat? There's something going on where it seems like it's not ladylike, or this is for, savages.
I'm glad you brought that up, because first I should clarify that for the past 5 years, I've worked at Smith College, which is an all-women's college. And so my most recent experiences have been with women. And before that, I worked for 7 years at Harvard University Health Service and worked obviously with men and women. My work has been focused on women the past 5 years, and Smith College, there is a very high percentage of my students at Smith who eat a plant-based diet, a vegan or vegetarian diet by choice. And I've thought a lot about this, and I think a few things are going on. One is there's just a cultural aversion. Like you said, they're sort of told that it's not ladylike to eat meat. They should eat the big salad, But also women are more likely to choose a plant-based diet for compassionate reasons. And they're also told that plant-based diets will be better for their health and for their weight. And women are often more likely to prioritize their appearance over their health. There's a few reasons why I think women are more likely to choose a plant-based diet than men. 74% of vegans in the United States are women. Nobody needs the critical animal food components more than women do, particularly for women who are planning a family, because it's really critical that women have an abundant supply of the omega-3 fatty acid called DHA, which is critical for brain development during pregnancy and for the first 2 years of life in particular. We need DHA throughout our entire lives, but that window of time, the few months leading up to pregnancy, up to about 2 years of life, the brain requires lots of DHA, which we can only get from animal foods or from supplements from algae, which most of my students don't take. So one of the things that I do with my students who choose a plant-based diet is to make sure they understand which supplements, if they're not going to change their diet, and that's obviously their choice, if they want to continue eating plant-based diet, I recommend specific types of supplements that can improve their access to nutrients. We don't know, we don't have any studies to tell us whether taking those supplements is just as good as consuming those nutrients in animal foods, but it's certainly the right recommendation to make.
So I did a long podcast with Larry Keith about some of the stuff you mentioned. My view, and it sounds like your view, is that it's almost the exact opposite of what we've been told on all accounts, where people think the plant-based diet is better for weight loss. I don't think that's true. It's better for the environment. Well, we need to make some changes in how we farm, but we know that ruminants are essential to the environment. They help soil health and carbon sequestration, tons of stuff like that. So it's nutritional, environmental, political, all the sides, everything that everyone thought about these plant-based diets seems to be wrong.
I agree with you. There is science. There are actual human randomized controlled trials. They're small and there's just a few of them, but they exist, demonstrating that plant-based diets can improve things like diabetes and heart disease and even obesity. So we do have those studies, and they are quoted all the time by doctors who promote plant-based diets. The problem with those studies is that they did not simply remove animal foods from the diet. They manipulated numerous other variables such as exercise, smoking, stress, etc., and they removed all of the junk food, all of the processed refined carbohydrates, and all of the seed oils that we were talking about, the vegetable oils. So with all of those changes, how in the world are you supposed to know which change was responsible for the health benefit? And I'm not aware of any study that's ever been done. And I have been in many debates with online, particularly with plant-based diet proponents and in public and in lectures and conferences, where I will ask, do you know of a single study where all you did was remove the plant foods and you showed a human health benefit? And nobody has ever been able to provide me with one. So simply removing animal foods from the diet is an untested hypothesis. We don't know if simply removing animal foods brings any health benefits. And that's the truth about plant-based science.
Yeah, and it makes perfect sense why they would improve stuff. Like you said, there's so many good things that it does. I'm not denying that, especially if you're going low fat. A lot of these diets are very low fat, which I think is bad, right, for your brain health, for a lot of your body, but it will in fact help you to lose weight, right? If you go low fat enough and you are eating carbohydrates from vegetables and fruits, then you will get healthier. Yeah, you could probably cure some diabetes and do a little better, but that's not saying it's the best way to do it or that it's efficacious for everyone.
I completely agree with you. And I think that there are many, many ways to lose weight. Obviously, if you stop eating, you're going to lose weight. It's not necessarily the healthiest thing to do for your body. You will eventually become malnourished and die. Calorie restriction, you will lose weight. Gastric bypass surgery, you will lose weight. So there are many ways to lose weight. The question is that your only goal? So if you care about other things besides weight, you want to pay attention to all of the other effects that your dietary changes are having on your health. If you eat an animal-based diet that is low in refined carbohydrates and seed oils, you are likely to lose weight as well, especially if the carbohydrates are low enough. Most people lose weight just as well or even perhaps a little bit better on an animal-based diet that is low in carbohydrates. So you don't need to starve yourself to lose weight. Yeah. You don't have to be hungry.
Well, that's the best part about these high-fat, low-carb diets is you're full all day. I mean, it seems universal that people, they're not relying on food every few hours. They're very satiated. They're very happy with what they're eating. They're getting to eat steak and eggs and things they like to eat. And, I was thinking of a graphic for the film about the different ways to lose weight and then what's optimal. It seems like the easiest way to gain weight would be a donut, right? It's a perfect combination of refined carbs, sugar, and fat, right? It's high fat, it's high sugar, you have no nutrient value, and you're getting all the inflammation from it's probably fried in seed oils. Okay. And the best way to lose weight probably be a protein sparing modified fast, which is just probably only meat and just some calorie restriction as well. And then if you go down the line from there, a carnivore and all meat diet with eating to satiety would be the next best way to lose weight. Then it would be a ketogenic diet maybe, and then just a standard low carb diet. You just go up from there. And it makes sense perfectly from a biochemistry perspective that to lose weight, you need to get your protein, your micronutrients, all that is in meat. And then you just minimize your fuel source. So if you're just eating the meat without excess, not slathering butter all over it. That's the most efficient way to lose weight, and you're keeping your protein. So the biggest problem with some other weight loss plans, like a juice fast or something like that, is people don't know this, but they're going to be losing their own lean muscle mass.
Exactly. And I can envision what you've got in mind for this graphic, because I've often envisioned a similar graphic for my writing to sort of show like the different levels of carbohydrate restriction and the different levels of nutrient optimization, if you will, what would optimize your nutrient delivery and minimize your excess energy. And so the one place where I think it's an open question is whether the carnivore diet might be best for weight loss and compared to a protein-sparing modified fast. And the reason why I am wondering about that, and this is really just a question, is because my own personal experience, and this is just me, now other people have shared similar stories, but I can't vouch for them. I have every diet in the world, I've been on it. So I find that on the carnivore diet, I naturally eat far less often, and it's not intentional at all. It's often just once a day, sometimes maybe once in a little bit, sort of a little half meal, one part of the day, and then a fuller meal later in the day. Compared to my ketogenic diet, which was extremely low carb and included some plants, as I said, I have lost 16 pounds in 3 months. And as a perimenopausal woman, that's kind of a miracle.
Yeah.
So I had tried various levels of fasting before on my ketogenic diet, and I found it very challenging to go for even up to 24 hours without eating. And now I can easily do it without thinking about it, and not intentionally. It's just happening naturally. I love that image that you have in your mind of showing people what their options are and sort of being able to dial up or dial down based on their metabolism.
Yeah. And I think I'm kind of talking about the same thing with the protein-sparing modified fast. Just an all-meat diet would be the best way. But I'm saying even to go beyond that, do that, but restrict a little bit. You know what I mean?
Oh, I see.
That's my version of the best would be a protein-sparing modified fast of just, say, ribeyes or, just some meat. Maybe if you really need to lose weight, you just have to cut calories a little bit more. But I totally agree that most people unconsciously cut calories when they're just eating animal foods because they are always satiated.
Yeah. And, I'm still on this journey, so I don't know if at some point I may need to intentionally restrict. I think that may be possible. I don't know yet. So far, I haven't needed to, but I can imagine that might be possible. So I'm definitely open to that. And I agree with you that calories can matter. Calories are not to be ignored, and especially for those of us with a damaged metabolism.
Yeah, there's definitely something to it, but it's definitely not the whole story.
Yeah, exactly.
It's certainly not all calories are created equal, and there's obviously hormones and so many things.
Yes.
So that I'm not accused of only taking one side all the time. And people on Twitter love to try to call me out and come out of nowhere and attack me, even though I'm nobody.
I don't know.
I'm sure all these other people who are well known or get much more of it. So we know we need to get adequate protein to keep our lean body mass while we're losing weight or any maintaining diet, not just a diet, maintaining good health for long term. So why can't that work out well? Or maybe it can with a plant-based diet. Now, how can you get the full amino acid profile, the full proteins, and not get too many calories? It seems like if you're trying to eat beans and rice to get enough of the actual protein you need, you're going to be making your insulin go through the roof because of all the carbohydrates you're going to have to eat.
That's a really good question. So as far as I can tell, the problem with plant-based diets doesn't seem to be protein insufficiency. It seems as though people who eat plant-based diets, most of them are getting enough protein. And depending on what they're eating, they're probably getting enough of the amino acids that they need. It's hard to say because it's so much harder to measure. The issue with plant-based diets is, like you said, those sources of plant protein come at a cost that animal foods don't have. One is that the natural plant foods that are high in protein sometimes are also very high in starch. And if you have insulin resistance, that may be a problem. So another issue is that if you're trying to get a low carbohydrate protein source, you're going to have to eat a lot of nuts, which don't agree with some people digestion-wise, or you're going to need to eat things like tofu and seitan, which are concentrated extracts of protein from these seed foods. Sort of tofu is from a soybean and seitan is from gluten. And some people are very sensitive to soy and gluten. They're actually very common allergens and causes of food sensitivities. And then the third issue is
as well.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Some of these foods, particularly soy, really high in phytoestrogens, which can disrupt hormonal balance in the body. And all of the seed foods that plant-based eaters rely on for protein are very high in anti-nutrients, lectins, phytic acid, which interferes with mineral absorption, protease inhibitors, which interfere with protein absorption, all kinds of things. So you can get your protein, but it's at a cost. And it's a trade-off. For some people, that's a trade-off that's worth making. If they're uncomfortable eating animal foods directly, that may be a choice that they make. They just need to understand that it might kind of wreak havoc on their gut or come with some insulin resistance along with the package.
Okay, that makes sense. That's kind of what I was thinking. And yeah, I think people should know that if they're going on a vegan diet for moral reasons, that they should realize that they may be sacrificing their own health. And if they still choose that, then that's up to them. It's just a little weird to me that they're choosing their own health over, a theoretical suffering of animals, which may not always be the case because, well, animals will die in some way at some time anyway.
Well, yes. And I love that you brought this up because there are two things that I've thought about along those lines. One is that my understanding is that when you turn land into a field of crops, corn or soy or whatever it is, you're destroying a lot of habitat for small animals, small and large. And when you're tilling that field with machinery, you are destroying lots of animals in that process as well. And so all the little creatures that live in that field. And so there's indirect death going on, but that's emotionally, even if people who choose a plant-based diet accept that that's a reality, it's still emotionally more comfortable not to eat the animal directly. And this is, as a psychiatrist, one of the things that I get is that we make our most important decisions often on emotions, not on logic. And so it feels really bad to some people to be directly responsible for the killing of an animal and to eat that animal. And that's an emotional argument that's hard to work your way around that. So many of my students at Smith chose a plant-based diet. I would try to explain the nutritional differences, especially if they were eating this way only for health reasons. I would try to explain that it's not actually healthier. I've never in 5 years been able to convince anybody to add meat to their diet. Zero conversions.
Interesting. Well, maybe I am doing well because I had a plant-based couple, I'm calling them, on the podcast, and they started eating sardines. They started eating some more animal foods.
Well, congratulations, because I do think it's better for health to include some animal foods, even a little bit. And it doesn't have to be, a big brown-eyed cow. It can be an oyster. Oyster doesn't have a face. I think it's a pretty underdeveloped nervous system, replenishable from what I understand. So, and it's really loaded with nutrients. So B12 and zinc and iron. Oysters, they have an underdeveloped nervous system. They don't have a face. They are replenishable, and they're, as far as I understand it, if I understand it correctly, and they are loaded with nutrients more so than red meat, zinc, iron, and vitamin B12, just a powerhouse. So there are options which may be acceptable to some people, more comfortable than eating a beautiful brown-eyed cow.
Yeah, absolutely. And we should talk about the oyster study, which is very interesting to me. Yes, eating oysters and nutrient absorption, eating that with different foods. So why don't you lay that out for us, please?
Sure. So I find plant foods fascinating, how they affect our ability to obtain nourishment for our bodies. And so particularly the seed foods, and by seed foods, I mean grains, beans, nuts, and seeds, which are all seeds. So for example, grains are the seeds of grasses, and all seeds are heavily protected, and all of them are very rich in a mineral magnet called phytic acid, phytate. And this mineral magnet interferes with our ability to absorb key minerals like magnesium, calcium, zinc, and iron. And it doesn't just interfere with our ability to absorb them from the seed foods, but it also interferes with our ability to absorb those minerals from other foods we eat at the same time. So there was this excellent study done a number of years ago demonstrating the extent of this effect. So for example, in this study, they showed that if you consume oysters, zinc-rich oysters, they're very high in zinc, you consume zinc-rich oysters, you see a nice big spike in blood level of zinc, which indicates that you've absorbed zinc nicely from those oysters. If you absorb that same amount of oysters with black beans, then you absorb only about half of the zinc from those oysters. And if you consume those same amount of oysters with corn tortillas, you absorb virtually none of the zinc from those oysters. So this is not a subtle effect. It really has a profound effect on our ability to extract minerals from food. And the brain requires all of these minerals. And zinc and iron deficiency are both quite common and may be contributing to mental health problems. Zinc levels are actually quite difficult to test for in the body. Most physicians don't test zinc levels. So many people are walking around with insufficient zinc without realizing it. And this could help to explain why people who choose a plant-based diet tend to be lower in zinc stores than the amount of zinc stored in their body than people who choose a diet that includes some animal foods.
It's so interesting to me, this study. When I heard about it, I watched a presentation by you on it. And this seems like, how can the other side argue? There's always arguments, macro wars of high carb or low carb. But can people argue with this?
I think it's really hard to argue with it, but the arguments that I've heard coming back at me from plant-based diet proponents are twofold. One is that, phytic acid also fights cancer. And so it's an antioxidant that fights cancer. So it has good properties as well. And we need to take those into consideration. And you don't want to get cancer, do you? And the other argument is that with the iron interference, for example, is they say, too many people have iron overload and too much iron is bad for the body. You don't want too much iron. But of course, iron overload is really uncommon. Anemia is rampant. 10 to 20% of women have anemia of childbearing age. In terms of the cancer fighting argument, phytic acid, if you isolate it and concentrate it and you give it to animals in a laboratory, it can kill cancer cells, but that doesn't actually mean it's good for you. You wouldn't recommend that people take chemotherapy every day if they're trying to prevent cancer. And we have no human studies, as far as I know, that demonstrate a cancer-fighting effect of eating these whole foods. It's a different thing to eat phytic acid as an extract, concentrated extract, than it is to eat the grains, beans, nuts, and seeds with the phytic acid in it. I don't know of any studies demonstrating that eating more grains, beans, nuts, and seeds can treat cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. We should quickly hit on bioavailability. In plant foods, that it's just not as bioavailable compared to meat, and a lot of these vitamins are fat soluble.
Right, exactly. So there are 4 fat soluble vitamins. Vitamin A, D, E, and K are all fat soluble, and we cannot absorb those unless we eat fat with our food, which is why a very low fat diet is not a good idea. Some of these vitamins are harder for us to obtain from plants, or they're in the wrong form, so we have to jump through some hoops to turn them into the correct form. So for example, a lot of people think that, orange vegetables like carrots and pumpkins are, really high in vitamin A, but actually they contain no vitamin A at all. What they contain is beta carotene, which is very hard to absorb, and we have to jump through lots of chemical hoops to turn it into active vitamin A. Whereas in animal foods, they contain vitamin A ready-made. So that's just one example of bioavailability, which just means it's hard to get the nutrients out of plants in some cases, much easier from animal foods.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we should do some more rapid fire stuff too. What about fiber? We have this sort of myth that everyone needs tons of fiber.
Well, that's a fascinating story because there haven't been any studies of high fiber diets versus no fiber diets. There have been lots of people who have experimented with this and have done just fine. Thank you very much, including myself. I used to have lots of gastrointestinal problems, and I don't have any on a fiber-free diet. But that may not mean anything for anybody else. But there are no studies showing that a high fiber diet is better for you than a zero fiber diet. There's one study that actually shows a zero fiber diet is better for you. And that study was an actual clinical trial showing that people with chronic constipation, it's a fascinating study, with chronic constipation were put on a very, very low fiber diet for, I can't remember how long it was. I think it was maybe only a couple of weeks. I don't have the study in front of me. If you'd like, I can pull it out and look at it. And then after that initial period of time, they were told they could go back on any diet they wanted, low, medium, or high fiber. What people chose to do on their own was very interesting. Then they checked back with them 6 months later to see which diet they had chosen to stay on. The majority of them had chosen to stay on a low fiber diet because on that diet, they had 100% relief of all of their gastrointestinal symptoms, constipation, bloating, And the people who had elected, the small number who had elected to stay on the high fiber diet, 100% of them had all of those symptoms that they were suffering with before.
Wow.
So that is a beautiful study that is really compelling. There isn't any clinical evidence that we need fiber. And the way we got into this mess in the first place of thinking that we needed it is because the studies that show that fiber is good for you compared diets high in fiber to diets high in refined carbohydrates, which are quote unquote low fiber. So there you've got this problem. Is it because you're eating more fiber? Or is it because you're eating less refined carbohydrate? So that's one issue. The other issue is that most of the studies that look at fiber for the treatment of gastrointestinal problems fail. They do not show a benefit. In fact, they often make things worse. Mm-hmm. And fiber is actually an indigestible. There are two types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. Insoluble is the rough stuff, the roughage that's sort of in the stalks and stems of plants, things like broccoli. And then the insoluble fiber is the stuff that holds water, like in the flesh of an apple, the pulp of an apple, which is juicy. So the rough stuff, the roughage, the stringy stuff, that stuff is very abrasive and impossible for us to digest. It's also impossible for bacteria in our systems to digest. So that just passes through, and along the way, it can cause some damage to your intestinal lining. That's been shown in studies. The soluble fiber, the pulpy, juicy stuff, that stuff is designed to hold water. And so it can can swell up inside of your intestines and form a gel. And that can cause constipation for some people. And the other problem with soluble fiber is that bacteria can break it down. We can't, but bacteria can. And when they do, they ferment it and create gases in the process, which can cause a lot of discomfort for people. So fiber is actually very difficult to digest. It's really hard on the gastrointestinal system. And it's not a nutrient. We don't require it. We don't absorb it. So there's no need to eat it. Some people do fine with it, but you certainly aren't going to solve any gastrointestinal problems in most cases by eating more fiber.
Yeah, I mean, there's tens of thousands of people proving you don't need fiber doing an all meat diet. So
right.
Well, what about gut bacteria? That's the hot topic these days, gut microbiota, biome.
Yes. So the microbiome is fascinating. It is complex. It is very poorly understood at this stage. It does communicate with the brain, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. But we have absolutely no idea what diet is best for the microbiome. All we know so far, and there are lots of people who claim that we do, but we do not. Mm-hmm. So all we know at this stage is at the level of associations. So for example, we know that people who seem to be healthier, if you look at the average population eating kind of regular diets, not zero fiber diets or strange diets, if you look at the average population and you take some healthy people and you compare them to some unhealthy people, the healthy people seem to have more diverse bacteria in their system than the unhealthy people. Mm. Then you do this epidemiological questionnaire type study where you say, okay, what have you eaten over the past year? How many cups of this and teaspoons of that and pats of this and ounces of that? And the researchers who administered these questionnaires and then analyzed them came to the conclusion that the people who were healthier and had the more diverse microbiome also seemed to be reporting eating a wider variety of plant foods. Mm-hmm. And before we finish with this round, I got to say one more thing about these studies is that we don't know what a healthy microbiome even looks like, because all of these people that are healthy who have the more diverse microbiomes, no two have the same microbiome. So it's not as though we know what kind of microbiome we're aiming for. And it's not as though we don't have any clinical studies yet showing that if you eat a certain way, you're going to have a better microbiome. We don't even know what a better microbiome is. It looks like healthier people have more diverse microbiomes, but does that mean, and then maybe they eat more plant foods if you believe these questionnaires, but does that mean that if you compare somebody who eats lots of plants with a very diverse microbiome to somebody who eats no plants at all like me, and I'm 100% healthy, my weight is I have a normal BMI, I take no medications, I have no health problems. If you take me, I'm healthy, and you look at my microbiome and you see fewer bacteria, is that going to mean that something is wrong? We don't know. I say eat what makes you feel good and let the microbiome fend for itself.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard all sides of this, and that seems to be it. And I've also heard that there's different ways to build a microbiome just with animal foods. There's different collagen or connective tissues or this and that.
Bacteria eat lots of things.
Yeah. there's also many populations or times in human history where we didn't have a ton of plant foods. So obviously we did fine.
That's exactly right. And so the microbiome will adjust very rapidly. Usually within 24 hours, will start to change if you change your diet. And again, we don't know what a healthy microbiome looks like. There was I'm sorry that I can't remember his name, but I was at this wonderful privilege to attend this wonderful conference in Switzerland earlier this summer where a leading microbiome researcher gave a presentation about the microbiome. And he mentioned something about comparing somebody who's eating a quote low fiber diet, which by his description was just had a lot of junk food and a lot of refined carbohydrates, to somebody eating a high fiber diet, and said that, the person eating the low fiber diet had an uglier looking microbiome. Well, that's not the right control for that experiment. What you want to do is compare no fiber to high fiber and see what happens.
So this was Swiss Re, which we've talked about before. And was it Tim Spector?
I think so. I'm not good with names, so I would have to check, but that does sound correct. And if it was him, I went up and asked him. I raised my hand during the Q&A, but there were so many people raising their hands. Only a few of us got called on. So I went up and asked him afterward if he had ever thought about a different control, comparing a zero fiber diet to actually test his hypothesis. That would give you a great answer. And he said he had not done that, but that I was welcome to send my sample in.
Wow.
So that's something that's on my to-do list if he was serious about that.
That's funny. We should get that on Meat Heals with Sean Baker and all those people.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about antioxidants for a second. I know you had an article in Psychology Today about the antioxidant myth. So go in a little more detail there.
Yeah. So, a lot of people are told that if they eat lots of colorful plant foods, fruits and vegetables, eat the rainbow is what we're told, right? That the reason why colorful plant foods are good for us is because the chemicals that give plants those beautiful pigments, they behave as antioxidants, which means they mop up these damaging free radicals that can spill out of our cells spill out of our chemical reactions if we're unhealthy. So these antioxidants, we're told we need them in order to be healthy, and we're told that we have to get them from plant foods. It's a huge booming business now. Lots and lots of money being made selling antioxidant supplements to people from plant foods. Vast majority of plant antioxidants are not essential nutrients. I mean, there are a few. There's vitamin C and selenium and vitamin E and things like that. We absorb those, and you can get those from animal foods as well. It's all these non-nutrient, non-essential antioxidants, things like curcumin that's in turmeric, or resveratrol, which is the supposedly magical ingredient in red wine. So these types of things are what we're told we need to eat in order to be healthy and keep antioxidant status in balance. So just a few examples here. The studies that try to demonstrate that these compounds like dark chocolate and fruit juice and red wine and turmeric are good for us, they're not properly conducted. For example, the turmeric studies, they don't use turmeric because we can't absorb curcumin from turmeric. We can't absorb any of these non-nutrient antioxidants very well at all. Most of them, almost none of them are absorbed. So how could they possibly behave as antioxidants if we can't absorb them? They behave as antioxidants in the plant, and they behave as antioxidants in a test tube. But just because a plant extract behaves as an antioxidant in a test tube does not mean it behaves as an antioxidant in the human body, especially if you eat it as a whole food. If you extract that antioxidant and concentrate it and do something to it to make it more absorbable, then yes, maybe it will get in and might help you with something, which is what they do with curcumin, for example. Pharmaceutical manufacturers have coated it with something that allows it to be absorbed, but that's not an argument for eating plant foods. That's an argument for buying a supplement from a manufacturer.
It's pretty expensive.
So it's pretty expensive. And in the red wine studies, for example, they use purified resveratrol at tens to hundreds of times the dose found in red wine. And of course, red wine is a powerful promoter of oxidation because alcohol is a powerful promoter. I don't think the 1 milligram of resveratrol in red wine is going to be any match for alcohol in the glass. Probably my favorite example of this marketing strategy is Palm Wonderful. So this very sexy bottle of, pomegranate juice is supposed to be loaded with cancer-fighting, free radical annihilating antioxidants. And it's got antioxidants in it, but we can't absorb them at all. It has two kinds in it, and we don't absorb either one of them. So, but what we get instead, what we do absorb from that bottle of juice is 32 grams of sugar from an 8-ounce bottle. And sugar is a powerful promoter of oxidation. So what you're getting is the opposite of what you thought you were buying.
It's so funny. So many of these things, it turns out to be the opposite. It's crazy. It's not just less than people claim, right? It's actually the opposite. And that's what I find so much with the environment. Oh, you're saying animals are ruining the environment. It is the opposite. If done correctly, I'm not saying all, sometimes you do factory farming and it's bad. But you raise cows properly, it's helping the environment. It's the opposite of what you're talking about.
They belong on Earth.
It's just so funny how many of these things, it is the opposite. Fiber, it is the opposite. You can have zero fiber. It's not just less fiber, zero.
Right. The less, the better.
It's so funny how this works. And I just think the world is backwards. But I guess we're trying to make changes here. And there's a growing movement of people who are fighting all this and spreading the information, which leads me to the whole meat thing, which is the biggest thing ever. I cannot believe that we're trying to say that something we've been eating for millions of years is killing us. It's so funny to me that we're trying to blame meat. I mean, maybe the only arguments I'll listen to is if you're saying the new ways that we're modifying it or some sort of additives we're doing to process it. Okay, I'll listen to that. But if you're just telling me red meat causes cancer, I can't take you seriously. So why don't you talk about the research?
Thank you, by the way. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah. Why don't you talk about the studies? I mean, you've gotten into this and sort of debunking the studies that they do.
Yeah, for every argument that there has been against red meat, for some reason, red meat is the villain, right? It's ever fish or chicken, or red meat is the villain. And there have been lots of studies trying desperately to pin the tail on this donkey.
That's all it is.
It's all it is.
It's so crazy. People, it's like Harvard Public Health. Just their whole goal in life is to try to bring down meat and promote grains.
Yes. And the fascinating thing is, once you step outside of epidemiology land, which is all smoke and mirrors and craziness, you can't find any evidence that meat is bad for you. When you look in the clinical trials, when you look in the laboratory experiments, when you look at how the body works, when you look at what's in meat, there's no evidence in anthropology, evolution, common sense, botany, every other branch of science, except for epidemiology, screams that meat is healthy. It's a superfood.
Yes.
And there's just no evidence against it. But they twist themselves into pretzels trying to do this, and people fall for it. Mm-hmm. And, the media falls for it. Other scientists fall for it. Doctors fall for it. The general public falls for it. I don't know why. I think a couple of really good examples of, meat is bad for you studies that are really well known. One is obviously the, meat causes cancer. The World Health Organization, several years ago proclaimed to the entire world that, red meat probably causes cancer and processed meat definitely causes cancer, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the evidence that they use to support their argument, it completely falls apart under scrutiny. So, for example, they looked at over 800 epidemiological studies, these questionnaire-based studies. And of those 800 plus studies, they chose, for whatever reason, they tossed out most of them. They tossed out 744 of them. Mm-hmm. They didn't say exactly why. Apparently they weren't convincing enough. So, and then they found 29, they selected 29 about red meat and colorectal cancer in particular. And of those 29 questionnaire-based studies, they were split essentially right down the middle. 15 of them seemed to say that there was no association between red meat and cancer, and 14 of them said that there was. So even if you believe in the power of epidemiology, which I hope you don't, they're split right down the middle. There's no there. You can't, they're a wash. Mm-hmm. And then in their report, they included only six experimental studies. And for all intents and purposes, only 2 of these were done in humans. One, there was a third one that was a repeat of the second one. So there were 2 human studies that tried to show that red meat causes cancer. And these studies were so flawed that it's really very difficult to conclude from these very small, unreproduced studies that meat causes cancer. In both cases, I'm just going to pull up these two studies because people always ask me, what do you mean there was something wrong with them? So the rat studies were all conducted on rats that had been pre-injected with a carcinogen before they were fed meat. And yes, you heard that correctly. And still they didn't develop cancer. So give them a powerful carcinogen and load them up with red meat, and they still didn't develop cancer. Their colon started to look a little funny, but they did not develop cancer. So in the human studies, the conclusion that I came to with the human studies is that with red meat in particular, because I'm not here to defend processed meat, but red meat, one way I summarize one of the studies is, you can look on my website if you want to read all the details of these complicated studies. It's called Who Says Meat Causes Cancer? So that my translation of one of these human studies, if you include 10.6 ounces of lean beef or lamb plus 2 cups of milk or orange juice in your usual diet every day for a month, biopsies of your rectum will show a 21% increase in the usual number of mutations in your colon cells. We don't know whether it was the red meat, orange juice, milk, higher protein intake, lower fiber intake, or some other aspect of the diet that led to the increase in mutation rate. These mutations are typically automatically repaired by the body and do not increase your risk for cancer. So they're not just changing one thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. You can't give people beef plus milk or orange juice.
That's insane.
What are you testing there? Yeah. And the second study, the translation, the summary is, if you eat a low fiber, high protein, high refined carbohydrate diet that includes 14.8 ounces of lean beef or lamb for 10 days, your colon cells will experience more mutations than usual. We have no idea what aspect of this diet is responsible for the increase in mutation rate, because they didn't, again, just add meat. They also gave these people a really junky diet.
Yeah.
So we don't know what's going on. And these studies were never repeated. They were very, very small, and they were done actually quite a number of years ago. And this was the best they could come up with, the World Health Organization, for experimental studies in humans. 2 studies, very small, very poorly conducted.
I'm getting angry right now. I already knew this information and I'm getting angry again. What is, people laugh at me when I say that the World Health Organization has a bias. And it's very apparent. Like, if you didn't have a bias, then these studies wouldn't exist, and you wouldn't be popularizing this non-data. And talk about the relative risk and compare it to tobacco or smoking.
Well, I am not the right person to ask about that, because the epidemiology piece of the story, which is where relative risks come from. So, for example, if my understanding is correct, this is not something I study myself. I don't study epidemiology. Let me put it this way. I don't waste my time studying epidemiology because I don't believe the methods generate any data worth analyzing. So, for example, and you mentioned before this recent study about the low carb diets will kill you more quickly than other types of diets, an epidemiological study. If you look at the questionnaire used to generate that study, nobody can answer those questions accurately. The vast majority of them, they ask you things like, over the past year, on average, how often did you drink 2% milk? Who can answer that question? I mean, unless you don't drink milk at all, or unless you have exactly the same amount every day, you're going to struggle with that question. You're not allowed to say you don't know or you don't remember. You're not allowed. That's not an option on any of these questionnaires. So I think it just generates junk data. But back to your question. So epidemiology, these questionnaire-based studies can be very helpful if you're looking at a single powerful risk factor for a disease like smoking. If somebody asks you whether you smoke, you can say yes or no. And you usually know about how many cigarettes you smoke because you have to buy them every week, and you know about how much you smoke each day. That's much, much easier to measure. And it's a single powerful variable. And it's an unnatural and a toxic, likely very toxic variable. So in epidemiological studies, I think they found something like smoking, the relative risk was something like, 10, which is, 10 times the risk of cancer if you smoke versus not smoking. Whereas when you look at these nutritional epidemiological studies and you calculate the risk, they're tiny, tiny risks. Something like, instead of, 10 times, it's like, and again, I'm not the right person to ask. I think it's like 0.2 or something. I don't know.
I've seen 14 for smoking, 14 to 30 something times compared to 0.18 for the cancer.
Yes, I think that sounds right. And with the nutritional epidemiological studies, what you find is these tiny, tiny increases in risk. And these are calculated based on the answers to these questionnaires.
It's noise. It's junk. It doesn't.
Exactly.
How can you report it?
Yeah, if you're connected to the journals, you get to publish this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, a few more things here. What about the specific things? People like to call out L-carnitine or heme iron, or I've heard N-nitroso compounds for bacon. So, well, that's specifically for processed foods. But so just for plain red meat, heme iron, carnitine, is there any danger there?
Yeah, so not as far as I can tell. And I have looked at that. So in the same article about, who says meat causes cancer, they actually interviewed one of the scientists by the name of David Klurfeld. He's a PhD, the USDA's National Program Leader for Human Nutrition. In 2015, he issued a statement saying, and I'm reading this direct quote, while heme iron can increase cell proliferation in the colonic mucosa of mice and catalyze the formation of N-nitroso compounds in rats, there is no data that normal levels of heme in human intestine contributes to any harm. And he was also one of the authors of the WHO report.
Wow.
So if he's any indication, it wouldn't make sense for a nutrient that we require that's in whole natural foods, ancient natural foods, to be dangerous.
It's completely illogical. And I saw you had a popular tweet, I think it was yesterday, about epidemiological studies. So let's talk about this study that's going around in every news outlet that everyone's talking about, that you mentioned at the beginning, trying to show that eating carbs reduce your lifespan. How can we get a study that's saying that eating bread is going to make you live a shorter time? This is very counterintuitive here.
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate study. It's gotten a ton of press. The study itself, again, I don't like to pay attention to epidemiological studies because I think they're a waste of time, but so many other people pay attention to them that I was pulled into the ring, so to speak. And I caved and I read this thing, which was just,
it's a waste.
Just a waste of time. But two key points to understand about this study. One is that the quote low carbohydrate group was eating 37% carbohydrate. That is not a low carbohydrate diet. This diet, they were eating, I think, 1,550 something calories, works out to 144 grams of carbohydrate a day. So if you believe the questionnaires, which you shouldn't, that's what they were reporting eating. And that's what the researchers considered to be the lowest so-called quintile, the lowest, the people eating the least amount of carbohydrate were in that group. They were reporting 37%. That's not a low carbohydrate diet. So there you go. And there were some statistical problems with it as well, which I'm not the right person to ask about. Professor Zoe Harcombe would be the right person to ask about that. But she showed that there was some statistical mumbo jumbo going on there in terms of reporting. But this study, what it did was it asked people, I think it pooled data from several studies over a number of years. Basically, it's asking people to remember what they ate and then using those answers to put them into groups and then seeing how long they live. And there are so many variables. There are thousands of ingredients in the average human diet, thousands. And most of them are not asked about on these questionnaires. So even if these questionnaires were perfect, how would you go about? It's different than smoking as a yes, no, one variable. How do you go about analyzing these thousands of variables in the modern diet? I think it's almost impossible.
And the quality, which kinds of fats? Are you eating the good fats, the bad fats? Are you eating what kind of carbohydrates? Are you eating there's so many things wrong.
So many things wrong. So I have taken to calling these things epidemiological studies because not just because the methodology is so ridiculous, but also because the hypothesis that the scientists are trying to test is kind of ludicrous in the first place and kind of flies in the face of all other branches of science. They don't take in, it's like the researchers who write these papers do not hold themselves accountable. They don't look at all the other evidence. They're unwilling to examine their own hypothesis and look for contradictions.
I have your quote here. Complete disregard for mechanic plausibility, often to the point of flying in the face of evolution, biochemistry, physiology, botany, and common sense.
Yes. All of those things.
Yes. This is what people always get caught up in. You're just like, wait a second, take a step back. What are we doing here? What are we trying? You're trying to
What
tell
are
me.
we trying to prove in the first place?
Yeah. So it's Walter Willett. So let's talk about Dr. Walter Willett for a second.
Well, I don't know him personally. I've heard him speak a number of times, live in person and in the audience, but I've never talked to him. And he seems like a very nice person.
Mm-hmm.
He's very knowledgeable and has a lot of experience. But my understanding is that he's sort of the father of nutritional epidemiology, and if I'm not mistaken, designed these food frequency questionnaires that are used in these nutritional epidemiological studies.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really a strong defender of them. And I understand if you've built your career on a methodology which is inherently flawed and which is coming under tremendous scrutiny and widely discredited in non-epidemiology science circles, I can understand why it would be hard for you to admit that you may have been wrong or that there may be some errors in that methodology that need to be addressed. And I think it's human nature to resist acknowledging that we've been wrong about something. And so he continues to defend these methods to this day, as does the tough scientist Dariush Mozaffarian. Mm-hmm. So I think that they just don't have a leg to stand on. They've got their reputations at stake, and they're going to dig in until the end.
Yeah. And does he publicly support a whole, just a plant-based approach or his grains, or there's something with this Harvard Public School of Health that is always pushing this grains and plants?
You're right. I actually took a graduate course in nutrition at the Harvard School of Public Health when I worked at Harvard a number of years ago. And it was taught by Professor Sachs. I'm trying to think of his first name. It'll come to me in a minute. So he is a lipid researcher. He studies fat and cholesterol. And he taught many, many lectures in that course on fat and cholesterol. And, he was clearly anti-fat in the diet, particularly saturated fat and animal fat in the diet. And, I had already started studying nutrition independently at that point, and I had a lot of questions about what he was saying. So I was shy at that time. I'm more outspoken now, but I was shy at the time. And at that point, he probably knew an awful lot more than I did. Mm-hmm. And so I took the course, and at the end of the course, I asked if I could meet with him. And it was Frank Sachs, that's his name. I asked if I could meet with him and ask him a couple of questions privately. And so I asked him, I said, where can I find, what would you I said, I'm doing an independent study project. What would you recommend? 1 or 2 or 3 articles that you think best demonstrate that saturated fat causes health problems? Not a questionnaire-based study, but, what are the best human mm-hmm. studies you can point me to? Because the literature is so vast. Mm-hmm. I just wanted some examples. He would not answer me, became really angry, and asked me to leave his office.
Wow. So
I don't know how to account for that reaction. I mean, perhaps I wasn't the first one who's ever asked him that question, but he basically, it felt like a very defensive response. I mean, I was asking very politely just for a few examples. I wasn't even really attacking him. Yeah. So it was a very strange interaction.
Well, it's very telling. And I just know that there's a huge bias on some people. Their life goal is to try to show that meat is somehow bad for us and that we should all be eating grains. So, oh man, we'll go out on this note. Just a few more things. I just thought of this thing that I've been thinking lately. If you go on an all plant-based diet, extreme, all plant-based, you're a healthy hero, right? You're the best. You're all animal-based diet. You're this deranged person who's going to die immediately, and everyone freaks out. And it's funny because both sides are very extreme. It's funny because both sides are convinced that they're correct and that the other group is completely wrong. And if everyone went on their side, the world's problems would be solved. And it's just really interesting to me, these two sides.
These are really extreme sides of the spectrum. And I think it would be a fascinating controlled trial to randomize people into these two groups and see what happens to their health. I am not, as much as it may sometimes seem this way, I really don't care what people eat. I'm not the food police. I'm a sort of eat and let eat person. Mm-hmm. My goal in life is to give people the information they need and let them make their own choices. And I respect everybody's food choices. There are lots of factors that go into choosing what we eat that have nothing to do with health. And so I just want people to have the facts.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I'm trying to do that for the film, is give the facts and not make any severe recommendations or tell people what to do. And also, I'm not going to say how much animal products we need, right? You decide that for yourself. I just believe we need some. Right. And then if you all only want to eat some oysters, then great, eat up those oysters because they're really going to help you. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there is a perfect amount of animal foods anyone needs to eat. You got to do what works for you and what you tolerate and how you can feel good and keep your lean muscle mass, get enough protein. And yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, that's right. And we're all very different. Our metabolisms are very different. There are differences in gender, age, health status. Most people do just fine with fruits and vegetables. Some of us no longer do. And I think it's just worth it for people to know, to look to plant foods if they've tried other approaches that haven't worked, if they've tried other dietary changes. It's not that I think most people, the last thing in the world they would suspect is a plant. And so I just want to encourage people to suspect plants if they have a health problem that hasn't responded to other healthy dietary changes like removing the junk food.
Yep. Just question everything, try things out. And we have to get you in the, we're doing a second film. It's almost guaranteed by now. We couldn't get you in the first one, but we're going to go into more details in the second one, go beyond into sustainability and, brain health and, maybe questioning these plants more. Can't wait. Hopefully you'll be available.
I would love to do that. Of course, would be delighted and honored to be included in that.
Awesome. Let's make it happen. So where we can find you, diagnosisdiet.com, Twitter, where else, where can we find you?
Yeah, Twitter, Georgia Eat MD, at Georgia Eat MD. My last name is spelled EDE. It's a strange last name. And Diagnosis Diet is my website, and I write for Psychology Today quite often. I'm on Twitter and Facebook Georgia Eat MD as well.
Awesome. Follow her. She's great. And we'll see her in the second film. So thank you so much.
Thank you for what you're doing, Brian, to share all this information with everybody. It's going to be great.
Awesome. Yes, I can't wait. All right. Don't forget the Kickstarter ends in less than 24 hours. Please support us there today. If you already have contributed, please share with a friend. Make sure to give us a review on the podcast app and follow along on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Just search for Food Lies. See you next time.